Hi folks, in the remainder of this video we're going to pick up where we left off in the last video where we discussed some general requirements for in-text citations and for research papers, and we're going to pick up with where we left off with paraphrasing, summaries, and direct quotes. So now that we know what a direct quote and a paraphrase and a summary is, we need to talk about how those should be cited within the text of your research paper. There's some very specific rules pertaining to this. Now, a direct quote, as you will recall, is a word-for-word restatement of a source's ideas. And again, those are directly quoted inside quotation marks. So for each one of these in your paper, you must immediately cite each one of these direct quotes following that quote. So for instance, I have an example here for you. In Social Justice Issue in Healthcare Management, An Elusive Quest, published in the Houston Journal of Health Law and Policy, George P. Smith II claims that, quote, as a direct consequence of the multiple and conflicting roles a physician is cast in or forced to choose between because of either the particular managed program he is practicing under or the professional ethic he espouses, medicine is no longer being seen as caring for people, end quote. And then I have an in-text citation there. So as you see in this particular example, the citation always follows the direct quote. There's never an exception to this rule. Now, one thing you will notice about this one is that at the end there's only a page number, and that's because I've introduced the source's name up here. And because of that, because I know a page number, I just give the page number and not the last name in the page number. Now, if for instance, I had one of those magazine or newspaper articles perhaps where the source was written by a staff writer and didn't really know who the author was, then I would have to use in the citation the word Smith rather than the number 33 there. But we'll talk about later on in a later video the 5 most common types of citations, and we'll discuss that a little bit more there. Okay, so how do we cite paraphrasing and summary? Here's an example here for you. So this is taken from the same source also. So what I did was I took some of those ideas and I sort of paraphrased and summarized them a little. Smith points out that economic self-interest has forced physicians to abandon the traditional sacred trust that once existed between doctor and patient for a system that promotes little emphasis on actual patient care. He notes the system encourages treatments that are expensive and evasive and sometimes place patients at risk. Due to this change in doctor-patient trust and lack of emphasis on patient care, Smith argues a new ethic must be embraced by physicians. And then I have a citation. Now, the difference between the citation rule here and the citation rule for direct quotes is that in a direct quote, I'm going to cite immediately after every single direct quote. In a paraphrase and a summary, I'm only going to cite at the end of the paraphrase and summary. Wherever that paraphrase and summary ends, that's where my citation goes. So, in other words, I'm not going to cite at the end of every sentence in a paraphrase, so there wouldn't be a citation here, and there also wouldn't be a citation here, because as you can see and throughout this whole piece here, there are no direct quotes. There is no word-for-word quote of the author, so it's all paraphrase and all summary, and the citation goes at the end of that. Okay, so what is a signal phrase? A signal phrase is often referred to as well as an author tag. It signals to your reader that the info that's about to follow is taken from a source and it's not your own original idea. If you go back to the example that we were just looking at, the signal phrases and author tags are highlighted in red here for you. Smith points out that. He notes. Smith argues. Each of these phrases allows my reader to understand that the information that's in this particular paragraph comes from a source and does not belong to me. For instance, if those were not there, this paragraph might say something like, economic self-interest has forced physicians to abandon the traditional sacred trust that once existed between doctor and patient for a system that promotes little emphasis on actual patient care. Now, if I had that sentence in my essay, in my research paper that I've written, then a reader would most likely assume that I was the one who actually wrote that and those ideas belong to me. So if you do not use a signal phrase, then it's unclear to a reader whose ideas these actually are. So if you don't have the signal phrase in front of ideas like this, then that's considered plagiarism. You must have both. You must have the signal phrase, and you must also include the citation as well. You must have both of those things to have a citation that is considered correct. So here's another example of that. So let's look at this little example here. So only through deliberate debate within a democracy can assumptions about aging, the value of life for the aged, and intergenerational responsibilities of assisting the elderly in their care be set, tested, or as the case may be, rejected. Now, as a reader, if I were to read that paragraph in a paper, I would assume that that paragraph was written by the writer of the paper themselves, and that it did not come from a source. So the only way that I can show my reader that this actually did come from the source, which is the case with this one, is that I must add, Smith argues that at the beginning. Smith argues that only through deliberate debate within a democracy can assumptions about aging, the value of life for the aged, and intergenerational responsibilities of assisting the elderly in their care be set, tested, or, as the case may be, rejected. And then, of course, because I'm using Smith's ideas, I would also have to cite that at the end as well. So notice how important that the signal phrases are. So keep in mind, every time you're paraphrasing, every time you're summarizing, and every time you use a direct quote, you must always, always, always use a signal phrase, and then you must also supply the citation for the source as well. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the most important things in a research paper is your own creation of new knowledge and adding your own voice to the conversation. What you cannot do is simply string quotes together and paraphrase and summarize someone else's ideas and then not really sort of provide your own slant on it. So, here's some ideas about how you can respond to an author's ideas. You should be presenting this information to provide support for claims, in other words, evidence that supports your thesis, or to add credibility to your writing, which is what we discussed earlier with the introduction of a source. You can use it to refer to work that leads up to the work you're doing now in the paper, like this particular slant that you're providing on the topic. Can give examples of several points of view on a subject by doing this, by responding to the ideas. So in other words, you can summarize how each of the sources is connected to one another and provide maybe sort of a comparison and contrast of the similarities and differences of those two things, and relate those back to your thesis statement or your claim. You can highlight striking phrases, sentences, or passages by quoting the original. You can use these examples to distance yourself from the original by quoting it in order to cue readers that the words are not your own, which is what we're talking about here with signal phrases. And you can also just use these examples from sources to expand the breadth and depth of your own writing. And again, all of this that you're doing all this information you're presenting should have connections back to your thesis and your claim, and don't assume that your reader's going to know what those are. It's your responsibility as the writer, when you present information from a source, to stop and explain to your reader what the connection is to your thesis and claim and why it's relevant and why it's important. So don't forget to do that. That's absolutely the most important part of the research paper. And here on this slide, I just have some model signal phrases for you. One thing you don't want to do is you don't want to repeat the same signal phrase over and over and over. You don't want to say Smith argues, Smith argues, Smith argues, Smith argues throughout your entire paper. So using some different terms here will help you vary the language and keep it from becoming repetitive. And then you also don't want to use the same verb phrase in the signal that you provide as well. So I have a list of different ones that you can use here as well, and so you want to vary those also. One thing you want to do is try to avoid repetition in your writing, and never repeat the same word more than once in a paragraph if you can help it. And there are a few ways that you can do that. You can use a synonym for a word so that you don't repeat it over and over. You can use a pronoun sometimes, and sometimes you can just delete the word altogether so that you're not saying it over and over. And so these verb phrases here are going to help you avoid repeating the same verb phrase over and over. So be sure you take a good look at these when you begin drafting your paper.